Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Sarah Caverly with the American Institutes for Research, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar for the Works Clearinghouse Statistics Website and Training Contract, or WWC SWAT. Today's webinar will highlight the guidelines for defining and identifying confounding factors within studies under the WWC Standards and Procedures version 4.0. We have two great presenters who will share their expertise and answer your questions. Dr. Herb Turner, the President and Principal Scientist of Analytica, is an adjunct professor of research methods at the University of Pennsylvania and Boston College, and has served as a reviewer for the Works Clearinghouse since its inception. Dr. Natalia Ganetka-Berry is a senior researcher at AIR and has led a range of evaluations using both experimental and quasi-experimental designs with a primary focus on educational settings. She is an experienced WWC certified reviewer and leads work on our SWAT contract. On today's webinar, we will explore confounding factors. We will begin with a review of information on confounding factors contained in the WWC Handbooks version 4.0. The majority of the webinar will focus on three different types of confounding factors recognized by the WWC in group design studies. Throughout the webinar, you can share questions with the presenters in the chat box, and we encourage you to do so. And near the end of the webinar, we'll have time for our presenters to respond to questions as time permits. Before we get started, we wanted to share the goals for this webinar. We hope you leave today with useful takeaways and a better understanding of and ability to identify confounding factors when conducting WWC reviews of studies using version 4.0 of the standards and procedures. We'll provide an overview of confounding and group designs, which include randomized controlled trials and quasi-experimental designs, and also review the three types of confounds recognized by the WWC. And we'll also be providing opportunities to practice identifying confounds. With that, I'll turn the webinar over to our first presenter, Dr. Turner.
Hi, Dr. Turner. Your microphone may be muted. You may want to try unmuting.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Sarah. I appreciate the introduction. I would like to begin the overview by defining a confounding factor, proceed to establishing the three characteristics of it, and conclude with how it has evolved over time in the WWC standards. So regarding what is a confounding factor is an aspect of a study that makes it impossible to tell whether the difference in outcomes is due to the intervention, the confounding factor, or both. Throughout this webinar, we will apply this WWC definition for a confounding factor to group design studies that use a randomized controlled trial or RCT design and a quasi-experimental design. Applying this definition to studies that use other types of designs, such as regression discontinuity, are beyond the scope of this webinar. Nevertheless, when applying this definition, it is important to decide whether there is sufficient information reported in the study to evaluate whether a confounding factor could plausibly affect the outcome in the absence of the intervention. Said differently, there must be sufficient evidence rather than inferences or assumptions that a confounding factor exists. Next slide, please. We begin by defining the three characteristics of a confounding factor. Throughout this webinar, we will repeatedly use these three characteristics to identify confounds in studies that use RCT and QED designs. Therefore, it is important to pay close attention to the definition. From the WWC perspective, a confounding factor is, first of all, it is observed, meaning there must be evidence reported in the study that the confound exists. And this relates to the last point I made earlier. Secondly, a confounding factor aligns completely with only one of the study's conditions. That is, the confound is present in one condition, but not the other. And lastly, a confounding factor is not part of the intervention under study. That is, there is a need to separate the effect of the confound from the effect of the intervention. Regarding this third characteristic, if the study factor considered as a possible confound is part of the intervention, there is no need to separate the effect of that factor from the effect of the intervention, because the factor is indeed actually part of the intervention. Next slide, please. And so this leads us to a natural question: what are the consequences of confounding for a study reviewed under the WWC? Well, the primary consequence is studies with a confounding factor received the does not meet WWC group design standards rating, or the studies are ineligible for review, in which case the studies would not receive a rating at all. A study that receives the does not meet WWC group design standards rating based on a confound cannot recover its rating. And a study ineligible for review based on a confound under one WWC review protocol may be eligible for review under another protocol. Now, regarding this second bulleted point, what we mean by a study cannot recover its rating is that there are no methodological or statistical adjustments that can be applied to remove the confounding factor so that the study can meet WWC standards. So in sum, the consequence of a confounding factor is it can result in a study not meeting standards or being ineligible for review and not receive a rating with regard to those standards. Consequently, it is important to be aware of what constitutes a confounding factor so that it is not introduced when designing a study, or it is not overlooked when reviewing one. Next slide, please. As some of you may know, the WWC standards have been in place since 2002, but were made publicly available as a handbook in May of 2008 with the release of Handbook 1.0. The definition of a confounding factor and the types of confounds that have been defined have evolved over time. If we start in the top left corner of the diagram, we see that Handbook 1.0 was released in May of 2008, and the definition focused on an n=1 confound, specifically with regard to the teacher. If we move to the bottom left of the diagram, we see that Handbook 2.0 was released in December of 2008, and it basically used the same definition that was used in Handbook 1.0. If we move to the top center of the diagram along the timeline, we see that Handbook 2.1 was released in September of 2011. It used the same definition as previous handbooks, but also expanded it to include the regression discontinuity design. And importantly, if we move to the bottom right, of the timeline, we see that Handbook 3.0, when it was released, the definition of an n=1 confound was refined, and it was also expanded to include two additional types of confounds. One additional type was the characteristics of a study or a study unit differ systematically between groups with no overlap. And the other type of confound is the combined or bundled interventions. And to conclude our discussion of the evolution of the confound definition, we are now under Handbook 4.0, shown in the top right of the timeline. That was released in October of 2017. And that handbook clarified and refined definitions for the three types of confounds and added more clarifying examples. And those are recorded in pages 81 through 83 of the handbook. Next slide, please. There are three types of confounds that we will cover: single unit confound, also known as n=1, group or participant characteristics, and combined or bundled interventions. During the remainder of this webinar, we will use the term confound and confounding factor interchangeably, and we will review these three types of confounds and how to identify them using hypothetical examples, real examples from reviews of studies using WWC standards, and knowledge checks to practice. As we proceed through the webinar, you will occasionally hear terms unique to the WWC, such as review team, review leadership team, and author query. This is because identifying confounds is not always a straightforward process and often requires deliberation among those who conduct reviews, that is the review team, among the content and methodological experts that lead them, the review leadership team, and may even require additional follow-up with study authors for more information, that is an author query. Finally, we will cover the three types of confounds in the order of their historical prevalence in WWC reviews, which are N=1 confounds have been the most prevalent, followed by group or participant characteristics, followed by combined interventions. And so with that backdrop and that overview, I would like to turn the webinar over to my colleague, Natalia.
Thank you, Herb, for this excellent introduction to confounds. And so let's go ahead and jump right in and go to the next slide. And we will begin with a single unit confound, also known as N=1. We see this confound when the intervention or comparison group contains a single study unit, and that unit is not present in the other condition. It can be a single school or a single instructor or a single classroom. And we will go ahead and review examples of this momentarily. First, though, the reason why the WWC considers single unit a confound is because the effect of the intervention cannot be separated from the effect of that unit. If we go to the next slide, and before we transition to examples, I would just like to emphasize what Herb said a little while ago, and that is if a study contains a single unit confound, it receives the lowest rating if it does not meet WWC group design standards. There is no statistical or methodological adjustment that a study can make to improve its rating. So now let's consider some examples, beginning with a few hypothetical examples. So let's go to the next slide. Our first example is a study that has 3 intervention classrooms and 3 comparison classrooms. And you see the description on the left side of your screen. All intervention classrooms had the same teacher in our example, who had no interaction with comparison classrooms. The question that we want to answer is whether one teacher in the intervention condition is a confound. A helpful approach to answering this question is to consider the characteristics of confounds that Herb introduced. That is, the confound needs to be observed, needs to align completely with one study condition and not be part of the intervention. In our example, a single teacher in the comparison condition checks all the boxes. It is observed, it aligns completely with the intervention condition, and is not part of the intervention. The conclusion in this case is that the study contains an N=1 confound. The effect of the intervention in our example cannot be isolated from the effect of one teacher in the intervention condition. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay. So it may be tempting to think that a single study unit, a single teacher, or a single school is always a confound. That is not the case. So on this slide, we included examples to show that a single study unit may or may not be a confound. The scenario on the left side of your screen is very similar to what we've just discussed in the previous slide. there is a single instructor in each condition, and this is really important, there is no overlap between the instructor and condition. No overlap means that there is an n equals 1 confound. We can separate the effect of the intervention from the effect of a single instructor in each condition. On the right side of your screen, however, one instructor does not create a confound. That is because the same instructor teaches classrooms in both conditions. We do not have a perfect alignment of instructor and condition, and if we don't have a perfect alignment, we don't have a single unit confound. Let's go to our next example. So here, let's consider a study in which 3 districts are participating. Districts A and B have schools in the intervention and comparison conditions. District C, however, has schools only in the comparison condition. A reviewer for such a study may wonder whether it contains a single unit confound because District C has all schools in the same condition, comparison condition. Again, it is very helpful to use the WWC 3 characteristics of confounds as a filter, as we're doing in the middle of the table on your screen. The key consideration for this example is the alignment of units and conditions. The districts and conditions do not perfectly align in this example. Districts A and B have intervention schools. Districts A, B, and C have comparison schools. So even though District C has all schools in the comparison condition, we do not have a perfect alignment of the district and condition because other districts also have schools in the comparison condition. And that's why, because we don't have a perfect alignment of districts with the study conditions, our conclusion would be that the study does not contain an n equals 1 confound. Let's go to the next slide, please. On the left side of your screen, the 2 scenarios are similar to the example we just discussed. Both scenarios contain an n equals 1 confound because a unit of study, a district, is perfectly aligned with only one study condition. The intervention condition in the example on top, the comparison condition in the example at the bottom. We included these 2 scenarios to emphasize that a perfect alignment is problematic when it occurs in either condition, not only in the intervention condition. When a unit of study is completely aligned with a comparison condition, as is the case in the bottom example on the left side of your screen, the study no longer has a reliable comparison condition, and that's why we won't be able to isolate the effect of the intervention in such a study. Alternatively, the scenario we're showing on the right-hand side of your screen is free of confounds because multiple districts are represented in both conditions. Next slide, please. This is our final hypothetical example of n equals 1 before we move on to examples from the WWC reviewed studies. So in this example, consider a study that examines the effectiveness of attending a career academy. A career academy in the study is one whole school. Students in a comparison condition attend multiple other traditional schools. The question is whether one school, which is a career academy, constitutes an n equals 1 confound. So let's go through the WWC characteristics of confound in the middle of the table on your screen. So you go through the filter and get to the last bullet. Remember that for a single unit to be considered a confound, it should not be part of the intervention. In our example, the career academy is the intervention because the career academy in this example is the whole school. The school and the intervention are the same. So what is the decision in this case? The WWC will not consider the school to be a confounding factor in this case. We included this example to illustrate a situation in which the presence of a single unit confound is less clear than in our earlier examples. The good news is that the review team leadership will weigh in on the review of studies like the study in this hypothetical example. A reviewer for a study like this, or any study for that matter, will have a lot of support. So I think it will be helpful for us to take a look at a few examples of actual studies that have been reviewed under the WWC group design standards. And let's go to the next slide to our first example. So I want to note one thing before we begin. For this webinar, outside of our hypothetical examples, we have selected all studies that have been reviewed under the WWC group design standards, and most of these studies are captured in the WWC study database, which is available on the WWC website. For those studies, you will see a review ID, such as the one you can see on your screen now in the study description, right next to the word description in parentheses. We included references for all studies used in the webinar at the end of the slide deck, and the slides and the references will be available soon after the webinar. So now let's take a look at this first example of a reviewed study. The study examined the effectiveness of a web-based math tutor on 7th grade students' math achievement scores. 4 schools were included in the study, 3 intervention schools and 1 comparison school. Does this study contain a confound? Now, I think that is a really simple example, so don't think about it too long, and we can go right next to our slide. Next slide. And yes, in this study, a single school in the comparison condition is a clear n equals 1 confound. We don't have a clean comparison condition in the study because there is only 1 school in that condition. Because we don't have a clean comparison condition, the effectiveness of the intervention cannot be isolated in the study. The study received the rating of does not meet the WWC group design standards. Before we go on to the next slide, I wanted to point out to you that on this slide and other similar slides, we show where in the study description we found information that helped us identify the presence of a confound. That information is in this pink or pinkish box on the right side of your screen. So for this study, the information was in the abstract and participant sections. So now we can move on to the next example. The study in this example examined the effectiveness of a targeted professional development intervention for teachers and school support staff on the reading achievement of students in grades 3 through 8. Included in the study were 21 intervention schools from the Iredell-Statesville district in North Carolina. The study's 42 comparison schools were from neighboring school districts. The question is, does the study contain a confound? We can go to the next slide. Now, this is another straightforward example of a study containing an n equals 1 confound. A single school district, Iredell-Statesville, is a confound. It is completely aligned with the intervention condition. That's why the effect of the intervention cannot be separated from the effect of that one school district. Any changes in achievement might have been due to other happenings within the district. The study was an I3 investing in innovation evaluation, and the authors acknowledged the n equals 1 confound due to one school district. If Iredell-Statesville contained only one comparison school, in addition to all schools in an intervention condition, the study would not have had a confound because the district would not have been completely aligned with the intervention condition. But as we all know, the evaluation team cannot always influence how and where the intervention is administered. And so the study received a rating of does not meet WWC group design standards. Now, our next few examples show where we picked because the presence of a confound is less clear. So in this example, a study examined the effectiveness of I Can Learn Algebra 1, which is a self-paced educational software intervention. The study was conducted in one high school. Students enrolled in Algebra 1 were randomized to intervention and comparison groups. It is not clear how many classrooms were included in the study, nor how many teachers taught each classroom. The text sometimes refers to the teacher and other time to teachers. One paragraph reads, "The I Can Learn classes were taught by a teacher trained in its use." Let's take a moment to consider the study's description before we go to the next slide, and in particular, take another look at the quotes directly from the study. Let's go to the next slide. A single teacher could be a confound in the study, but it is unclear if the study had one or multiple teachers in the intervention condition. So what happened with this study is an author query was sent out, but received no response. Therefore, the study was rated does not meet the WWC group design standards. And before we move on, I would like to emphasize just one more time that when the presence or the absence of a confound cannot be confidently assessed, our review team leadership will weigh in. Now let's go to our next example. So this is our last example of n equals 1 from the WWC reviewed studies before we move on to some knowledge checks. So in this example, a study examined cognitive intervention processing, which is an intervention intended to improve students' decisions about careers. The text suggests multiple implementers. For example, the text states that there are 2 school counselors assisting the researcher. Step-by-step description of the intervention consistently mentions the researcher and only one researcher. The researcher referred, the researcher summarized. This is how the text describes the involvement of school counselors. One counselor assisted in administering the pre-test, post-test instruments. The second counselor assisted in reconciling student schedules with intervention activities and in scheduling students for any needed makeup sessions. Again, let's take a few moments to consider how the authors described implementation. Now let's go to the next slide. As with the previous example, it's not clear right away if the study contains a confound. Although the text suggests that the intervention had multiple implementers, one researcher, and multiple school counselors, the involvement of school counselors appears minimal. The leadership team weighed in on the study review and decided that the intervention had an n equals 1 confound at the implementer level because the study only had one researcher who was the true implementer of the intervention. The counselors provided support, but were not the implementers. the study received the rating of does not meet the group design standards. And now we're going to transition to a few knowledge checks to practice N equals 1, and I and Herb will guide us through those knowledge checks.
Thanks, Natalia. So it's time for us to start with our first knowledge check. We have 3 knowledge checks scheduled for this particular section. And the purpose of these knowledge checks are to give you an opportunity to practice using the confound assessment framework that we have presented and discussed through these examples. I think it's important to note that the confound assessment framework that we provided you for is just that. It is a framework to organize your thinking, because identifying confounds is not necessarily a straightforward practice. So for each knowledge check, we will read a summary description from a study actually reviewed using WWC evidence standards. After reading the summary, we would like you to evaluate it for a confound using the 3 characteristics required for identifying an N equal 1 confound. You will be able to use an on-screen poll to record the results of your confound assessment. After closing the poll, we will show you the answer and review it with an explanation. As with the examples that Natalia showed you, the section of the study where we found the confound information will be shown to the right of the answer and the explanation in a highlighted box for your review, but we will not read it aloud. So let's begin with our first knowledge check and look at the description for this study, where Beck and Chizek in 2008 examined the effectiveness of using cooperative learning to teach a computer science course. The study was conducted at San Diego State University. The intervention condition included 34 students, and the comparison condition included 37 students. One instructor taught all students in the intervention condition, and another instructor taught all students in the comparison condition. Does the study contain a confounding factor? And you may note that if the knowledge check poll shows up at the center of your screen, you should be able to move it to the right or to the left out of your way so that you can respond to the poll, but also read the study description. So we'll go to the poll, and we'll be tracking the responses as they come in, so I can have a sense of when we can move on. Okay, and it looks like 50% of participants have responded to the poll, so if you haven't responded yet, we'd like you to do so. Okay, so why don't we take a look at the answer? So it appears that this identifying this particular confound was pretty straightforward. 96% of people said yes, 4% of people said no. And as you can see on the screen, the answer is yes. The study contains an N equal 1 confound. And the reason is a single instructor in either condition is a confounding factor in this study, because the effect of the intervention cannot be isolated from the effect of the instructor. And the single instructor in each condition was perfectly aligned with those conditions. But notice we had a single university also in this study, but the single university is not a confounding factor, however, because it's not completely aligned with either conditions. That is, it was present in both conditions. So let's move on to the next knowledge check. So in this study, Murphy et al. Examined the effectiveness of a blended learning intervention, which combines traditional classroom instruction with online instruction. The study was conducted in first-lane charter organizations, 4 elementary schools. One school implemented the blended learning model in grades K through 8 for 1 academic year. 3 other schools served as the comparison condition. So once again, using the confound assessment filter questions, we'd like you to determine, answer the question, does the study contain a confounding factor? Okay, and it appears about 50% of participants have responded to this poll. We'll just give a few more seconds for others to respond. If you could get your answers in so we could have a high response rate and an accurate assessment of what your assessment was for the confound. Okay, so at this time, why don't we look at the responses? And so it seems this one was not as straightforward in terms of 78% of you responded that yes, there was a confound, and 28% responded no. So let's take a look at the answer, and also more importantly, the explanation. So yes, the study contains an n=1 confounding factor. So notice a single school in the intervention condition is a confounding factor in this study, because of the effect of the intervention cannot be separated from the effect of the school. But what I'd like you to focus on for a moment now is the note that follows, which says, note that the school in this study is the site for the year-long intervention. It is not the same as the intervention. So regarding this note, this goes back to the hypothetical career academy example that Natalia went through earlier, in which, although there was only one school in the intervention condition and multiple schools in the comparison condition, the school and the career academy intervention were one and the same, and thus there was no n=1 confound. In this particular knowledge check, the school and the intervention are not one and the same. The school becomes a site for where the intervention can be delivered, and consequently, there is an n=1 confound, and this study received a does not meet group design standards rating. Let's move to the next knowledge check. And this will be our third and final knowledge check. And I'll give you more time to respond to this one because we made it purposely more complicated and nuanced. So this is a study by Kura that examined the effectiveness of school-based health centers. The study was conducted in 2 high schools. School A had a school-based health center and a nurse. School B only had a nurse, who was the same nurse as in School A. Students from either school were included in the study if they received medical services within the study period. The intervention group included students from School A who received medical services from the school-based health center at that school. The comparison group included students who received medical services from a school nurse at either School A or School B. Which n=1 confound does this study contain? Choose all that apply. So as I said, we'll take a little bit more time for you to give you more time to respond to this one. But I would encourage you to use the 3 filter questions that we've gone over as a framework for making your decision. So the filter questions are: is there evidence in the study of the confound? That is, can it be observed? The second question is, for the factor under question, is it the possible confounding factor under question, is it perfectly aligned with one condition but not the other? And the third is, for the possible confounding factor under consideration, is it part of the intervention or not? Those are the three questions. Can it be observed? Is it perfectly aligned? And is it part of the intervention? Now, granted, as Natalia had mentioned, sometimes the answer to those questions are not necessarily straightforward, and that's the reality of confounds are they can be nuanced, and it may require discussion within the review team. It may require discussion between the review team and the review team leadership, and it may require, even after those discussions, it may require an author query. So we don't want to minimize the nuance here based on the framework. But as I said, the framework is at least a way to organize one's thinking. And we have 60% of the responses that are in, and so I think we'll go ahead and take a look at the results and move on to the explanation. So, I think from an item difficulty perspective, we've got a fairly even response pattern, and would suggest that this might be a good item for differentiating understanding about confounds. So let's take a look at the, or it could be an unclear item as well. But let's take a look at the response, and you can be the judge. So does the study contain a confounding factor? Yes. The study contains an n=1 confounding factor for a single school-based health center. So here's the explanation. The single school-based health center is a confounding factor in this study because the effect of the intervention cannot be isolated from the effect of that one center. And I think that should be clear. But now where things get a bit more dicey are in this next sentence. School is not a confound in this study because neither school is perfectly aligned with the study conditions. What we mean by neither school is neither school A or school B is perfectly aligned with the study conditions. And so notice that school is not a confounding factor in this study because although school A is the only school in the intervention condition, it is also in the comparison condition. And notice that school B, it's not the only school in the comparison condition. It is in that comparison condition with school A. School A is represented in the comparison condition. And it may be tempting to conclude that school A is a confound because it's the only school in the intervention condition, but the additional and crucial characteristic of an n=1 confound is that school is perfectly aligned with one study condition and not the other. And school A was not perfectly aligned with the intervention condition because it was also represented in the comparison condition. Notice also, one school nurse is a possible confound, although it is not clear from the text. So remember the classification of a confound, one of the filter questions is there has to be evidence in the study. And what we're saying here is one school nurse is a possible confound, although it is not clear from the text that students who receive medical services from the school-based center also interacted with the nurse. If they did, one school nurse would not be considered a confound. And so now we will move to the transition to our next type of confound, and I will turn the webinar back over to Natalia.
Thank you, Herb. Before I begin this next section, I would like our audience to know that n=1 is the longest section in this webinar. It is the longest because n=1 is the most frequently occurring confound, as Herb mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, which is why we pulled as many examples as we could fit into the webinar. we will go through the remaining sections faster. So the next section is about the group or participant characteristics confound. This confound occurs when group or participant characteristics that could affect the study outcomes differ systematically between the intervention and comparison groups with no overlap. These group or participant characteristics should not be part of the intervention. Note that when overlap between group or participant characteristics exists but is imperfect, the WWC does not consider the study to have a confound. We'll go through examples of this confound next. One thing that I want to note is that just for simplicity, we sometimes call this confound the characteristics confound. So let's go to the next slide. Studies that contain the characteristics confound receive the rating of does not meet the WWC group design standards. And like with the N equals 1 confound, the studies with characteristics confound cannot recover their rating. And now let's take a look at a few hypothetical examples before we move on to examples from the WWC reviewed studies. Let's go to the next slide. So you're already familiar with this format where we have the description on the left, our filter in the middle, and the decision about the presence or the absence of the confound on the right-hand side of your screen. So in this example, consider a study of a new social studies curriculum in which a small group of teachers with a master's degree implements the curriculum. Students in the comparison group are taught by teachers with bachelor's degrees. The question is whether teachers' master's degrees in the intervention condition is a confound. Like we've done earlier, we can apply the WWC's characteristics of confounds as a filter, which we're doing in the middle of the screen. And what we find when we do that is that the characteristics in question, teacher's master's degree, is observed, aligns completely with the intervention condition, and is not part of the intervention. It checks all the boxes. Therefore, this characteristic would be considered a confound. Before we move on, I'd like to emphasize 2 points. One is that for a characteristic to be considered a confound, we should expect it to affect the outcome. So our assumption in this example is that teachers' master's degrees could affect the study's outcomes. The second point is that the characteristic in question should not be part of the intervention. In our hypothetical example, had teachers' education been a component of the intervention, for example, the intervention specified that only master's level teachers could lead the intervention, then teachers' master's degrees would not have been a confounding factor. Let's go on to our next example. In this example, consider a study in which classrooms in the intervention condition have a much lower rate of students who are eligible for a free or reduced price lunch compared to classrooms in the comparison condition. Is lunch eligibility a confound in the study? Going through the filter, we see that lunch eligibility is observed, not part of the intervention, and this is the key consideration for this example, lunch eligibility does not perfectly align with only one condition. There is some overlap between the groups and lunch eligibility. Lunch eligibility, therefore, is not a confound in this example. And now let's go on to the next slide. Well, we need to go over a few additional considerations for the characteristics confound. And our first consideration is volunteering. WWC does not consider volunteering to be a confound in experimental studies if volunteers are randomly assigned to conditions. Next slide, please. In quasi-experimental studies, volunteering is also not a confounding factor. The selection mechanism and differences in observed characteristics are a concern to the WWC. Therefore, the highest possible rating for a quasi-experimental study meets WWC group design standards with reservations. So for example, if students in an intervention condition in a QED study volunteer to take a new curriculum, volunteering will not be considered a confound. Let's go to the next slide. One more thing to mention is time. Time is a characteristic that can be a confound. Time is a confound when the intervention and comparison groups are observed at different times. Studies in which time is a confound are often labeled as successive cohort or cohort design studies. So for example, an intervention group includes fifth graders in 2010, a comparison group includes fifth graders in 2009. In this case, time will be a confounding factor. So let's take a look at a few examples that we pulled out from the WWC reviewed studies. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so first study examined the effectiveness of an autonomy supportive law school environment. The purpose of this intervention is to relate students' interests and priorities to their professional training. The study was conducted in 2 law schools. The intervention group included students from School A. The comparison group included students from School B. Students in an intervention condition were from the cohort that started in 2002, and students from the comparison condition were from the cohort that started in 2001. The question here is, does the study contain a confound? Let's go to the next slide. Time is a confound in the study. Both cohorts are observed and assessed at different times. Therefore, the impact of the intervention may be confounded with any changes that occurred between the time periods. A single school in each condition is also a confound in the study. It's an n=1 confound because it is impossible to separate the effect of the intervention from the effect of one school in each condition. The study received the rating of does not meet WWC group design standards. Let's go to the next example. Here, we have a study that examined the effectiveness of a middle school mathematics curriculum, the Connected Math Project. The intervention group included 7th graders in the 2006-07 school year. The comparison group included 7th graders from the same school in the 2003-04 school year. Students in an intervention condition were the second highest group of math students in the school based on state standardized test scores. The same teacher taught all students. Let's take a moment and consider group characteristics in the study before we go to the next slide. Let's take a look at the answer. Let's go to the next slide. So yes, time is a confound in the study because students were observed in different school years. The effect of the intervention is confounded with changes that might have occurred over time. But there is another possible confound in the study, and that's the level of math achievement of students in the intervention group, who were the second highest group of math students. The reviewer for this study pointed out that the study's description had no indication that the comparison group included students with the same level of math achievement. So it's not clear if there is an overlap between the groups on the level of math achievement. Regardless, though, of whether there was or wasn't an overlap in the level of math achievement, the study received the rating of does not meet WWC group design standards because time is a clear confound in the study. So I think we're ready to do some practice, and Herb will lead us through a couple of knowledge checks.
Okay, everyone. So once again, after reading the study summary, we would like you to evaluate it for a confound. Once again, using the 3 characteristics or the filter questions that relate to the requirements necessary for a group or participant confound to be present. Then we will show you the answer and review it with an explanation. And as I stated before, the section of the study where the confound information was identified will be shown to the right of the answer and the explanation in an highlighted box. So let's take a look at this first study where McGrath and Bird in 2012 examined the effectiveness of the Pathway to Success program, which provided supplemental services such as college skills training to incoming college freshmen enrolled in developmental coursework. The study was conducted in one 2-year college. The comparison group included students from the 2003-2004 academic year, and the intervention group included students from the 2008-2009 academic year. So again, considering what Natalia just covered, does the study contain a confounding factor? Okay, and it looks like 50%, about 50% of you have responded, so we'll just take a few more seconds to give you an opportunity to respond. So why don't we take a look at the responses? Okay, it looks like that one was pretty straightforward, and people, 100% of you said yes. And so if we take a look at the next slide, and the answer, yes, the study contains a time confound. The intervention and comparison groups are observed at different times with no overlap. Therefore, the impact may be confounded with any changes that occur between the 2 time periods. So let's move on to the next knowledge check. So in this one, and it's purposely a bit more involved, so we'll give you more time to reflect on this one and to respond to the poll. Burris, Hubert, and Levin examined the effect of accelerated math on student level and school level achievement in high school. So we're looking at the intervention effects at 2 levels. The intervention condensed 4 years of math taught in grades 6 through 9 to 3 years taught in grades 6 through 8. For student level outcomes, the intervention group included 5,008 students who entered high school in 1998, 1999, and 2000. The comparison group included 477 students who entered the same high school in 1995, 1996, and 1997. So we want you to think about potential confound with respect to the student level. Then also we have for school level outcomes, the intervention group included 1 high school that enrolled students who received accelerated math, and the comparison group included 6 similar high schools from the same county. So thinking about both levels of the estimated effects, does the study contain a confounding factor? Approximately 50% of you have responded, and so we'll just take a few more seconds to give the rest of you a chance to respond, and then we'll take a look at the answer. Okay, why don't we take a look at the results? So it looks 97% have said yes, 3% have said no. So let's take a look at the answer. The answer is yes. The study contains a time confound and an n=1 confound. So notice how we arrived at that conclusion. The study contains a time confound for student level outcomes because students in the intervention and comparison groups were observed at different times. As a result, the impact may be confounded with any changes that occur between the two time periods. At the school level now, the study also contains an n=1 confound for the school level outcomes because only one high school was included in the intervention group. Therefore, the impact of the intervention cannot be isolated from the effect of that school. And so that concludes our knowledge checks with respect to the group and participant characteristics. And so now we will move on to our next type of confound. Can you go to the next slide, please? So this is our third and final type of confound. And so we'll go through two hypothetical examples. We then have a couple of two actual examples, and then our knowledge checks. And we'll then be ready to conclude with our questions and answers and additional resources. So in terms of this final type of confound, so we've covered the n=1, we've covered the group and participant characteristics, and this third type is the combined intervention. And so when a study combines interventions, only one of the included interventions is of interest, and only one of the included interventions is of interest to the WWC. The WWC will consider the combined intervention ineligible for review. So this is really trying to give a heads up to study designers about combining interventions or bundling interventions. There's nothing wrong with bundling interventions in and of itself. The complication that occurs when we talk about conducting systematic reviews of the intervention is the WWC, when it reviews it, may be interested in one intervention and not the other. So this is not necessarily a design flaw as opposed to a product of the procedures and standards of the Works Clearinghouse. And then the second point we want to make and emphasize is that combined interventions that are ineligible for review do not receive a WWC rating. The purpose of this slide is to highlight one of two scenarios of bundled or combined interventions in the confound section of the WWC handbook. The first scenario, as just described, is when a review-eligible intervention is combined with a review-ineligible intervention. The combination itself is ineligible for review and does not receive a rating. The next slide, please. A special case, which was rare in our data on WWC reviews, is when both the treatment and control groups receive the ineligible intervention, and the difference between the groups is the eligible intervention. In this case, the bundled intervention may still be ineligible for review, but the effects of the two interventions can be disentangled, as described in this slide. So the WWC will not consider a combined intervention a confound if both the intervention and comparison groups receive the ineligible intervention. In that case, the effect of the intervention of interest to the WWC can be separated from the effect of the ineligible intervention. Let's look at two hypothetical examples. The first example is for the first scenario. The second example is for the second scenario. So the next slide, please. So notice here, in this example, the focus of the review is a math software program that is eligible under the review protocol. Students in the intervention condition were exposed to the math program and a reading software program. So there's been the bundling of those two, or combining of those two interventions. And the study reported the effects of the two software programs combined. So when we conduct the confound assessment, we ask, is the intervention of interest combined with another intervention? The answer is yes. Is the combined intervention eligible for review? And the answer is no, because the review that was eligible, that the program that was eligible under the review was the math software program, but it was combined with a program, the reading program, that was ineligible for review, and consequently, the combined intervention was ineligible. Is the intervention not of interest delivered to the comparison group? No. The intervention that was not of interest, the reading software program, was only in the intervention group, but not in the comparison group. Therefore, the decision is the study is ineligible for review. The math software program that is eligible for the review is delivered with a reading software program that is not eligible. The study will not receive a WWC rating. Next slide, please. So that was the first scenario we had looked at. Now here's the second scenario where we want to disentangle the effect of the review eligible intervention from the review ineligible intervention. So notice how this is done. The focus of the review is a math software program that is eligible under the review protocol. Students in the intervention condition were exposed to the math program and a reading software program. Students in the comparison condition were also exposed to the reading program. So in terms of the confound assessment, notice the key difference. The key difference between this example and the previous example is if you look under the confound assessment, under the last question there, is the intervention not of interest delivered to the comparison group? And the answer is yes. Therefore, our decision was, because all students in the intervention and comparison conditions received the reading software program, the only difference between the two groups is the math software program that is eligible for the review. And so this particular combined intervention would proceed through the WWC review and actually receive a rating. Next slide, please. So now we will look at three examples before we move to the two knowledge checks. And so in this first example, Murphy et al. Examined the effectiveness of a blended supplement for teaching middle school math using a quasi-experimental design. During the 2011-2012 school year, 2 intervention schools blended a supplemental online math program with a year-long algebra and geometry course. Teachers encouraged students to use the program to personalize their math learning during the course. In 2 comparison schools, students participated in a traditional math course, enrolling in either an algebra or a geometry course during the same school year. The supplemental online math program was the focus of the review. So the question is, would this study be eligible for review and thus potentially receive a study rating from the WWC? Let's go to the next slide, because we are running up against the time. Does the study contain a confounding factor? Intervention schools implemented the online math program at the same time the new year-long algebra and geometry course was implemented. It is not possible to separate the effects of the program, which was the focus of the WWC review, from the effects of the year-long course. So in terms of the study rating, this study would not receive a rating and it would be ineligible for the review. Could move to the next slide, please. In this particular scenario, Kramer, Kai, and Merlino conducted a multi-year quasi-experimental study to examine the effects of NSF curriculum on middle school math achievement. 2 suburban districts in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, 20 intervention schools used math in context or the connected mathematics program, whereas 118 comparison schools continued using a preferred math curriculum other than MIC or CMP. The WWC reviewed the study under the primary school mathematics protocol for the CMP intervention report. So the intervention of interest was connected mathematics project. So the question is, would this study be eligible for review, and does it have a confounding factor? And again, for the sake of time, I know we want to get to some question and answer. I'm going to just move to the next slide and say, yes, the CMP curriculum of interest to the WWC is combined with another math curriculum that is ineligible for review. Therefore, the combined intervention is ineligible for review. So once again, this combined intervention would receive no rating and would be ineligible for review. And then our last example. We go to the next slide. Oh, so now we're ready to move to the knowledge check. And so I'll turn it back over to Natalia.
Thank you, Herb. So before we go through this first knowledge check, I just wanted to acknowledge that this is a lot of information to take in. So it may be a welcome news that this is our final round of knowledge checks, and we only have 2. So let's jump right into this one. And so in the study, in this first knowledge check, is a quasi-experimental study that examined the effect of 3 NSF-developed textbooks on student achievement of about 2,500 students in 10 middle schools from multiple school districts. In 6 intervention schools, either the Connected Mathematics Project textbook or one of 2 other textbooks was used. In 4 comparison schools, publisher-developed textbooks were used. Now, this is important. The study was reviewed for the Connected Mathematics Project intervention report using the Primary Math 3.1 protocol. So the question is, do you think the study contains a confound? And as you think about this, I'd like to acknowledge the comments in the textbook, the chat box. It would be nice to have the additional information to be able to answer some of these knowledge checks. So please just go with the information that you have available to you, because we pulled the most critical pieces that we could include given the limitations of the webinar. So you should have the knowledge check box in front of you, and please go ahead and make a selection. So let's go ahead to the next slide and take a look at the answer. So the study does contain a confound, which is aligned with most of the answers that we received. And the explanation that follows the answer tells you that the combined intervention will be considered a confound in the study. The intervention group in this study, which includes all 6 schools, used a combination of 3 books. Therefore, the study examined the combined effect of the 3 books. The effect of the Connected Mathematics Project, which was the focus of the review, is confounded in the study with the 2 additional curricula used in the intervention group. And let's go on to our second and final knowledge check on the next slide, please. Thank you. The WWC reviewed study in this knowledge check examined the effectiveness of reciprocal teaching. which is a guided reading comprehension strategy. 49 freshman students enrolled in 2 intact heterogeneous English language arts classes in a suburban high school in the Midwest were randomly assigned to an intervention and comparison group. The teachers of both groups had comparable academic training and years of experience. The teacher in the intervention group implemented the reciprocal teaching and the direct explanation model, which is another reading comprehension strategy. The teacher in the comprehension group used traditional reading instruction. For this knowledge check, we ask you to identify if the study contains an N equals 1 combined intervention, perhaps both or neither. Okay, we're just at about 50% responding, so let's take a look at the answers. And the majority of our audience answered that the study contains both confounds, which is the correct answer here. So let's take a look at the explanation. First, the study contains an N equals 1. There is only one teacher in the intervention group and only one teacher in the comparison group. Therefore, the effect of the intervention cannot be separated from the effect of one teacher in each condition. Second, the intervention of interest to the WWC, reciprocal teaching, is bundled with another intervention, the direct explanation model. Therefore, the effect of reciprocal teaching cannot be disentangled in this example from the effect of direct explanation model. This was our last knowledge check, and I think we're ready to transition to our section with Q&A, and Sarah will guide us through it.
Great. Thank you, Natalia and Herb, for sharing all of that helpful information and the level of detail. Prior to our webinar, as you all registered, you shared questions, and then we've been tracking the questions that have come in our chat box today throughout the webinar. So thank you for participating in that way. And I want to give Natalia and Herb an opportunity before we delve into some of our deeper questions. There have been quite a few inquiries about the confound of N equals 1, focused on our health centers that was implemented in one school. And so I'm wondering if you could take us back and maybe give us some clarity on why there was a confound there and help us understand that a little bit better.
I can, Sarah, I can quickly, I saw that as Herb was going through this knowledge check, there are lots of questions coming up in the chat box about health center and why is that a confound? And the confusion, I think, was coming from comparing health center to the example that we used with the Career Academy. And so some people were wondering, well, how is the health center is not the same as the Career Academy? And what's helpful to think about when figuring out situations like this is whether or not the whole school is the intervention, or whether a school is a site for an intervention. And in the example that Herb was walking us through, the health center and the school were not one and the same. In fact, you know, the school contained the health center, there was also a school nurse, and not the entire school was, like I said already, the health center. So that's the distinction in that example, and I hope that it's helpful.
Great. Thank you for that, Natalia. And I do want to remind our participants that all of the Q&A will be posted along with the archived webinar, so you'll be able to access it. And our presenters will also be going back through all of the Q&A and making sure that we respond to all questions. Noticing that we just have the 10 minutes left, so we won't be able to get to everyone's questions but please be assured that those responses will be posted. So with that, let's dive into some of the questions that we received were about specific research-based practices in meeting the WWC evidence requirements. So for example, Marzano's practices. And so I'm curious, Herb, if you could speak towards that for us.
Sure, Sarah. Yeah, I think the response to that is that only interventions that have been reviewed by the WWC will have a WWC rating of effectiveness. We recommend that members of our audience who are interested in a specific study or intervention search the WWC database of reviewed studies. We're now posting a link to the WWC search engine in the chat box.
Great.
And I mean, we're posting that in the chat box. And also, if a study or intervention does not appear in the database, it means that the WWC has not reviewed the study at this time. Not that the study or the intervention does not meet WWC standards.
Great. Thank you, Herb. Also, we received several questions about how to design and implement studies that are free of confounds. So, Natalia, can you help us with that one?
Yes, these are such excellent questions, and I really wish that we had a one simple answer for these questions. Unfortunately, there isn't one. Our recommendation is to think through the study design very carefully. It really is the best time to make sure that the study has enough units in all conditions and that the characteristics of groups and participants are shared between conditions. Of course, even the most careful planning cannot prevent, for example, attrition. An intervention group of 5 schools may only have 1 school when the study is completed because other schools have dropped out. If that's the only school that can be included in the outcomes analysis, then despite your best planning, the study will have an n equals 1 confound, and the study will receive the lowest WWC rating. Now, we encourage you to remember, though, that the WWC rating is not intended as the rating of the usefulness or value of your research, but whether it is internally valid. If the review identified concerns with the study's internal validity and received a low rating, use that review to design your next study. And one last thing to mention here, to keep in mind that if you plan to design a study that combines interventions, depending on the WWC review protocol, the study may or may not be eligible for review. So your best protection in that case is to deliver the second intervention that may not be of interest to the WWC to the comparison group if you're interested, first and foremost, in the rating that the study will receive.
Great. Thank you, Natalia. So we also received a question about how the confounding applies to group interventions. So Herb, hoping you can speak to that for a bit.
Sure, Sarah, and this is also a very interesting question. I think when it comes to responding to it regarding how confounding applies to group interventions, it's important to remember that a confound can occur at any level and in any intervention, a group intervention or an individual intervention. So for example, a study can have an n equal 1 confound in a school level intervention if only one school is included in either condition. If multiple schools are included in both conditions, but one teacher teaches all students in an intervention condition across all schools and does not have any interactions with students in the comparison condition, then the study will have an n equal 1 confound at the instructor level. And of course, you should always be on the alert for n equal 1 confounds at the district level.
Thanks, Herb. So our next question is if there are templates and exemplars for district researchers to use. Natalia, do you want to take that one?
Yep. I'll take this one. One more question is, I'm going to have to say that there isn't one solution or a template for every study. However, in this webinar, we presented a filter with 3 characteristics of confounds, which we think can be very useful for deciding if a study contains a confound. The filter is a 3-question that we went through when reviewing hypothetical examples. If a confound is observed, aligned with only one condition or part or not part of an intervention. So consider running your study units and group and participant characteristics through this filter as we have been doing through this webinar. Once you've applied the filter, you will be well positioned to make a call about a possible confound in your study. And as we've already stated earlier, the best time to do that is in your study design phase.
Great, thank you, Natalia. Our next question is how the WWC definition of confounds compares with the definition of confounds in other disciplines.
Yeah, I can take that one, Sarah.
Great, thank you.
Different disciplines have different unique characteristics of confounding factors. However, the unifying idea of a confound is that it is a design feature that prevents the researcher from accurately estimating the intervention's effect. In other words, as we had said previously, I think what's common across all disciplines is there's an understanding that there's really no methodological or statistical adjustment that can be applied to it because it is a design feature that can prevent the researcher from accurately estimating the intervention's effect.
Great. Thank you, Herb. I'm curious, this confound N of 1, you mentioned that this was the most prevalent confound that we see within the WWC context. And I'm curious, we have a question about how the N of 1 confound extends to the district level. And Herb, you referenced this, that researchers should be alert for the N equal 1 confound at the district level. So wondering if you can expand on that just a bit to help us better understand what an N of 1 confound looks like at the district level.
Yeah, well, we actually, in the slide that Natalia went through, it actually showed an example of what the N equal 1 confound looks like at the district level, in which you had, in the intervention group, there was district A, and then in the comparison group, you had districts B and C, and there was an N equal 1 confound because district A was perfectly aligned with the intervention group. I think where it gets tricky to identify in practice is the reviewer may be focused on levels below the district, like the number of schools that are in each condition or the number of classrooms that are in each condition. But our advice is it's always important to go one level up if possible, because if at that higher level, that level is perfectly aligned with one condition and not the other, by definition, it is a confound. Keeping in mind, though, with a lot of confounds, there's often a discussion that would occur between the review team and the review leadership team to ultimately make that decision.
Great, thank you, Herb. And I hope that lends clarity to some of those questions that our participants had for the N equals 1 at the district level. So this concludes our time for the webinar today. I'd like to thank our presenters and our participants for joining us today and deepening our knowledge of confounding factors. And just as a reminder, we have 2 upcoming webinars through the SWOT team, one of which is focused on using the WWC in the post-secondary context. And Dr. Turner will be joining us for that webinar as well as one of our presenters that will be held on April 23rd. And another webinar is focused on coding the study context during the review process. And that webinar is scheduled for May 8th. So start watching out for that registration link coming soon. Also, just as a reminder, we'll be posting an archive of the webinar from today along with the Q&A. So we will be responding to all of those questions that you have and that you posted during the webinar as well. You are always welcome to follow up with us if you have additional questions that come up along the way. in between us posting it. And those will be highlighted on the WWC website. Also, just as a reminder, we've shared several links with you today, of which you can access the version 4.0 Standards and Procedures Handbook. If you are not yet a certified reviewer, we do have the online training for group design certification. Also in the coming year, we will be providing in-person training for single case design certification as well underneath the SPOT contract. And those of you who are certified 3.0 and want to be certified version 4.0, there is a recertification process for that as well, and we will share those links on the posted archive. So with that, I thank you all and look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.